The morning of my daughter's wedding, I stood in the bridal suite of the Grand Harlow Hotel adjusting the veil on her head, and she looked up at me in the mirror with tears running down her cheeks and said, "Mom, I could never have done any of this without you." Those words. I held on to those words for 4 years like a woman clutching a life raft in open water, refusing to let go even as the current tried to pull them under. I should have let them go the moment she changed the subject from gratitude to inheritance. But before I tell you what happened, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from. Stories like mine travel to the strangest and most unexpected corners of the earth, and every single person watching matters to me more than I can say. My name is Margaret. I am 71 years old, and I am writing this from a sun-drenched apartment in Porto, Portugal, with a glass of vinho verde on the small wooden table beside me and more peace in my heart than I have felt in 30 years. A bowl of sweet clementines sits on the windowsill. The sounds of the city come up from below, the tram on the cobblestones, a street musician somewhere nearby, the ordinary beautiful noise of a place fully alive. Getting here cost me everything I thought I had. And it was still worth every single thing it cost. But let me start at the beginning. Because this story did not begin with a phone call about an elder law attorney or a glossy brochure for a care facility slid across my kitchen table or a Thursday night conversation that rearranged my entire understanding of what my life had been. It began long before any of that, in the ordinary and completely unguarded way that most significant things begin, with love that had no idea it was being shaped into something that could later be used against the very person giving it. I was born and raised in the city of Raleigh, North Carolina, the daughter of a tobacco farmer and a schoolteacher. We were not wealthy people. We were people who understood, in the bone-deep way that comes from watching your parents count money at the kitchen table on Sunday evenings, that financial security was something you earned slowly and protected carefully and never, ever took for granted. There were no shortcuts between sacrifice and a dignified life. My father said this often, not as a lecture but as a fact, the way you state the weather. My mother kept a written ledger for every household expense from the day she and my father married until the day he died at 81. She said once, sitting at that same kitchen table with her reading glasses low on her nose, that a woman who does not know where her money is going is a woman who will one day discover it has gone somewhere she did not choose. I smiled when she said it. I thought I understood. I did not fully understand what she meant until I was in my 60s, sitting alone at my own kitchen table in the dark, counting columns and realizing exactly how much had gone somewhere I had not chosen and why. I became a licensed pharmacist at 24. I married my husband Gerald at 26, at a small ceremony in the church where my parents had married 30 years before. By 29 I had our daughter, Cassandra. We called her Cassie from the day she came home from the hospital, wrapped in a white blanket with yellow ducks on it that my mother had made by hand. She was the kind of baby who made you forget every difficult thing that had ever happened to you. Wide dark eyes, a laugh like a small bell struck once and then humming, and an absolute certainty even as a toddler that the world existed specifically and entirely to delight her. She was not wrong. For a long time, at least from our corner of it, it did. Gerald worked in civil engineering for the city of Raleigh. We were a two-income household, and we were disciplined about it in the way my parents had modeled for me. We saved first and spent what remained, every month without exception, from the first month of our marriage to the last. It did not make us wealthy. It made us secure. That security was something I worked for with the particular ferocity of someone who grew up understanding how quickly the ground can shift, how one bad season or one illness or one piece of bad luck can undo years of careful building if you have not built carefully enough. We gave Cassandra a good life. Not an extravagant one, but a full and solid one. Piano lessons from age 7, with a teacher on Elm Street named Mrs. Prescott who smelled of lavender and had the patience of a saint. A summer dance program every year, held in the gymnasium of the Arts Center downtown, which Cassie attended with the seriousness of someone training for the Olympics. The best public schools in our district, followed by a private university when her grades qualified her for a partial scholarship and my savings were sufficient to cover the rest without borrowing. I paid $114,000 out of pocket over 4 years to put Cassandra through Holloway University, a private school in Virginia she had fallen in love with during a campus visit when she was 16. She stood in the middle of the green quad on a warm October afternoon, her hair loose in the breeze, and she turned to look at me with her hands spread wide at her sides as if she were measuring the space, and she said, "Mom, this is where I'm supposed to be." I looked at my daughter standing in the middle of that beautiful place and I told her we would make it work. We did. Gerald died of a sudden cardiac event when Cassandra was 22 and I was 52. It was a Wednesday in March. He had gone to work that morning with a travel mug of coffee and a plan to attend a city council meeting about a road widening project in the East Corridor, and by 2 in the afternoon I was sitting in a hospital corridor under fluorescent lights being told by a doctor who had the kindest possible eyes that there was nothing more they could do. He was 54 years old. He had seemed, that morning, in every way like a man who had decades remaining. I do not have adequate words for what that year was, and I have tried many times to find them. Grief of that kind does not operate the way people who have not experienced it imagine it does. It is not a cloud that eventually lifts and reveals the same sky you remember. It is a restructuring of everything, of time and space and the ordinary texture of days that you did not realize were held together by a particular person's presence until that presence is gone and you discover that the whole architecture of your daily life was built around someone you can no longer reach. He left me the house we had bought together in the Lakeview neighborhood of Raleigh, which by then had appreciated to roughly $580,000. He left me a life insurance payout of $200,000, a retirement account worth $340,000 that we had been contributing to together for 26 years, and 30 years of memories so thick and textured I could hardly breathe through the first year without him. Some nights I sat in his reading chair in the corner of the living room simply because it still carried the particular impression of him, the slight slope to the right where he always leaned, and I stayed there until I felt something close enough to his presence to sleep. Cassandra came home for the funeral, stayed for 3 weeks, cried beautifully, made casseroles she left labeled in the refrigerator, and then went back to her life in Richmond, Virginia, where she was working as a marketing coordinator for a real estate development company. She called me twice a week that first year. Then once a week. Then once every 10 days or so. Then whenever she remembered, which became less and less predictable. I understood. She was young. She was building her life. She had her own grief and her own world to manage. I told myself this sincerely and without resentment, because it was what I believed and because it was what I had raised her to do, to be capable and independent and able to function without me. I was proud of her capability even when it meant she did not call. What I did not understand, and would not fully understand until it was almost too late to do anything about it, was that something was happening in those years of distance that had nothing to do with normal adult independence. I was already being quietly sorted in my daughter's mind from the category of parent into the category of resource. It is a reclassification that happens so gradually, in such small and individually unremarkable increments, that the person being reclassified often does not notice it until the final stage arrives and the language shifts and suddenly what was always called love is now being called management, and what was always called your home is now being described as a burden you need help carrying. When I think now about those years before Cassandra met Marcus, I think about a kind of life I had arranged around being necessary. After Gerald died, necessary became the frame through which I understood my own days. I was necessary to Cassandra's well-being. I was necessary to the pharmacy consulting group where I had begun working part-time. I was necessary to the household I maintained, to the garden, to the routines that gave shape to grief when grief would otherwise have no shape at all. Being necessary is not the same thing as being valued. I understand that distinction now with a clarity I wish I had possessed 20 years earlier. But when you are 52 and newly widowed and your only child is across the state and the house is very quiet, necessity has a warmth to it. It keeps you from the deeper and more frightening question, which is, who am I when I am not being needed by someone? What do I actually want, apart from what is required of me? What does joy feel like when it belongs entirely to me and not to the service I am providing to someone else's life? I did not ask those questions. I kept myself busy and I stayed available and I waited for the calls that came less and less often, and I told myself this was simply what life looked like at this stage, and I was, In this, wrong in a way that cost me a great deal. Cassandra met Marcus Hale at a company retreat held at a resort in Charlottesville when she was 27 years old. He was 31, a project manager at a construction firm, tall and confident with a handshake that communicated authority and a smile that communicated warmth. When she called me that Thursday night, her voice was breathless in the particular way of someone who has decided something and wants the person they are calling to agree. "Mom, I think he's the one." I asked her all the right questions. What was he like as a person, not as a prospect? What did he value when things were difficult? Was he kind to people who had nothing to offer him? She answered each one in the way a young woman answers when she has already made her decision and is conducting what looks like a conversation but is actually a request for permission. I gave her what she was asking for. I said he sounded wonderful. I said I could not wait to meet him. I meant both of those things at the time. I met Marcus for the first time at Thanksgiving that year. I cooked for 12 hours. He arrived with good wine he had clearly researched in advance and a firm handshake and a smile that I spent the evening trying to read correctly. He was polite in the way that certain people are polite when they are performing politeness rather than feeling it, when the warmth is a decision rather than a reflex. He complimented my cooking 3 times in the first hour, which is precisely once more than genuine appreciation requires and once less than flattery, a careful middle register. He spoke about money and investment trends at the dinner table with the breezy authority of a man who thinks about these things constantly but wants to be seen as someone who thinks about them effortlessly. He referred to his own mother twice as a lot to deal with in a way that landed lightly enough that you could miss it if you were not paying close attention, but I was paying close attention. But Cassandra was glowing across the table from him. She was happy in a way I had not seen her happy in years. She laughed easily. She touched his arm when she spoke to him. Her whole body had the quality of something finally at rest. So I smiled, past the sweet potatoes, and held my observations loosely in the way that you do when you love someone completely and you hope with everything you have that you are wrong about the things that are bothering you. I was not wrong. Marcus proposed on New Year's Eve, 18 months after they met, at a restaurant Cassandra later told me she had known was the setting because she recognized it from the photographs he had been saving on his phone. The ring cost $22,000. He had financed it. She told me this detail proudly, as evidence of his commitment, as if financing a luxury item before you have established a financial foundation were a romantic gesture rather than a piece of information about how a person manages money when they want something and do not have the funds for it. I smiled and said the ring was beautiful, which it was, and I filed the information away in the part of my mind where I kept things I did not yet know what to do with. The engagement lasted 14 months. And from the moment that ring went onto my daughter's finger, I became the primary financial engine of the wedding machine that began assembling itself around her. It started with the venue, because it always starts with the venue. Cassandra had dreamed of being married at Belmere Estate since she was a teenager. It was a restored 19th-century plantation house that had been converted to an event venue, set on 40 acres about 40 minutes outside of Raleigh. She had pinned a magazine photograph of it to her bedroom wall when she was 15 and it had stayed there, alongside her dance recital programs and her college pennant, until the day she left for Holloway. The place was breathtaking in photographs and even more so in person, the kind of place that looks like a painting of itself. Oak trees draped in Spanish moss lining the long gravel drive, a wide white veranda that wrapped around 3 sides of the main house and caught the evening light in the particular way of something that was built before electricity and has been catching that specific light for 150 years. It was also $34,000 for a Saturday booking, and that figure did not include catering, bar service, rentals, or anything else. "Mom, I know it's a lot," Cassandra said, sitting across from me at my kitchen table with the venues quote in a printed folder she had brought specifically for this conversation. "But it's the only place I've ever wanted. I've imagined my whole wedding there since I was 15 years old." I looked at my daughter's face and I thought about the photograph on her bedroom wall and I thought about all the years between that photograph and this moment and I said, "I'll cover the venue." What I did not say, because saying it would have required naming what I was already sensing, was that covering the venue was only the first item on a list that no one had yet shown me in full. The catering came next. 240 guests, at $185 per head, for a seated 5-course dinner that would follow a separate cocktail hour with past appetizers and a raw bar. The total for catering alone was $44,400, with a 20% deposit required within 30 days of signing the contract. I wrote the check. Then came the photographer and videographer package from a team Cassandra had found through a wedding photography blog she had been following for 2 years, $11,500, which covered both days of the wedding weekend including the rehearsal dinner. The florist, whose work Cassandra described as lush English garden style, full and romantic and slightly wild, quoted $9,200 for the ceremony and reception florals combined, the altar arrangement, the aisle markers, the 12 centerpieces, the bridal party flowers, the cake flowers, and the cocktail hour arrangements. The wedding cake was a 5-tier construction with fresh flowers and hand-painted sugar details designed to match the estate's garden palette, executed by a baker in Chapel Hill who had a 6-month waiting list and charged $4,800. The band, a 10-piece group from Nashville with a horn section that Cassandra had seen perform at a colleague's wedding and had dreamed about ever since, charged $18,000 for the evening. The lighting designer who would transform the estate's ballroom for the reception charged $7,600 for his services and equipment. The wedding stationery, which Cassandra had designed with a calligrapher and which included the invitations, the reply cards, the day of programs, the menus, and the table numbers, came to $3,400 for printing and materials. I kept a ledger throughout this entire process. My pharmacist's habit, my mother's daughter. Every number in a column, every date recorded, every check number and wire transfer confirmation documented in a spiral notebook I kept in the drawer beside my kitchen phone. I kept it not out of suspicion or resentment. I kept it the way I kept all financial records, out of the simple discipline of a woman who had grown up watching her mother write down every dollar that entered or left the household, and who believed that what you document you understand and what you understand you can manage. That notebook would later become one of the most important objects I possessed. At the time it was simply habit. The dress came after 6 separate shopping trips to 4 different boutiques across 3 states, including one in Atlanta that Cassandra had read about in a bridal magazine and that required an overnight stay. The dress she ultimately chose was a French designer gown, a cascade of silk organza with hand-sewn lace detailing at the bodice and a cathedral-length train that required 3 separate alterations appointments and considerable practice walking. It cost $14,700, and I paid for it the same afternoon she said yes to it, standing in a dressing room in a boutique in Charlotte with her face in the 3-way mirror looking like everything she had ever hoped to be. I cried before she did. There are moments that earn their cost, and that was one of them. I have never once regretted that particular check. The hair and makeup trial, the day of hair and makeup team for the bride and 4 bridesmaids, $3,800. The rehearsal dinner, held in the private dining room of a restaurant in downtown Raleigh that Cassandra had loved since her college years, for 60 guests with a 3-course menu and open bar, $8,600. The bridal brunch I hosted at my own home on the morning of the wedding, catered for 30 women including the mothers, the grandmothers, and the bridal party, $2,100. The transportation, 3 vintage cars and a classic white sedan that Cassandra had seen photographed at a wedding on the same blog where she had found the photographers, $4,200 for the full day. The hotel block I coordinated for out-of-town guests, which involved months of calls with the hotel and the negotiation of a group rate and the management of a rooming list that changed 11 times, no direct cost, but the administrative weight of it fell entirely to me, along with the cost of the bridal suite for the wedding night, which I paid as a gift, $890. The contribution I made toward the honeymoon, a 12-day trip to the Amalfi Coast with a suite at a hotel Cassandra had wanted to stay in since she saw it in a travel magazine at her dentist's office, $12,000. The engagement party I hosted at my own home 8 months before the wedding, for 110 guests, with a caterer, a bartender, a rented tent for the back garden, flower arrangements, and a custom celebration cake, $9,400. Marcus's family made one financial contribution to the wedding, $8,000 toward the rehearsal dinner, presented as a check Marcus handed me at the rehearsal itself, the evening before the wedding, the way you might hand someone a birthday card while the party is already in progress. That was the full extent of their participation. When I added every line of my ledger, when I totaled every check and transfer and receipt from the 14 months of engagement and the wedding weekend itself, the number was $197,400. $197,400. I paid for it with a combination of sources that I managed carefully and that I did not disclose to Cassandra. Gerald's life insurance money, which I had been protecting since his death and which I had told myself I was saving for something important, a significant portion of it went here. A portion of my retirement savings, withdrawn early and therefore subject to penalties, $14,300 in penalty fees alone, gone before I saw a cent of the principal. And a home equity line of credit taken out against the Lakeview house, the house that Gerald and I had bought together in 1989, and that was by then the largest and most important asset I possessed. I did not tell Cassandra about the home equity line. I did not tell her about the retirement penalty. I did not tell her what it had cost me, the specific numbers, the specific sacrifices, because I did not want any of that to reach her on her wedding day or in the months before it. I did not want her joy to be complicated by awareness of what was being given for it. I wanted her to have the wedding she had always dreamed of, cleanly and fully, without obligation shadowing it. This was, I understand now with a clarity I did not have then, one of the most expensive silences I have ever kept. Not because I should have refused to help her, but because when we protect the people we love from understanding what their happiness has cost us, we deny them the information they need to see us as full human beings rather than as functions. We make ourselves invisible in precisely the way that later allows us to be overlooked. I made myself invisible for Cassandra's wedding, and she overlooked me for 4 more years, and then she and her husband consulted an elder law attorney about mechanisms for taking my house. I am not saying the silence caused what came later. I am saying it contributed to a pattern that made what came later possible. On the morning of the wedding, standing in the bridal suite of the Grand Harlow Hotel, watching my daughter look at herself in the mirror in the dress I had paid for, in the moment I have already told you about, when she said she could never have done any of it without me, I believed completely that she understood. I believed she felt the weight and the love of what I had given. I believed we shared an understanding of what that morning represented, not just romantically but in the full human sense of what one person had done for another. I was wrong about that too, in ways I would not fully understand for another 4 years. The first 2 years of Cassandra and Marcus's marriage looked, from the outside and from my position inside the family, like the beginning of something solid. They bought a townhouse in a new development in Cary, North Carolina, about 15 minutes from my house in Lakeview, which I thought at the time was a lucky proximity. I would be close enough to help when they needed it and far enough away to give them their privacy. This seemed like the right arrangement. It did not occur to me then that proximity to me was part of why they had chosen that location. I helped them furnish the townhouse. I contributed $18,000, spread across several weeks of purchases, the appliances, which the builder would only upgrade before the closing date, then the living room furniture, which Cassandra had found at a showroom and which she said was exactly right and that the sale was ending that weekend, and then the dining room table and chairs, and then the bedroom furniture for the guest room, because Marcus's mother would be visiting and they wanted the room to feel proper. Marcus mentioned twice in those weeks that they had overextended a little on the closing costs and were working to rebuild their savings, and that anything I could contribute toward getting settled made a real difference. I told myself this was normal. Parents help their adult children get established. This is what families do when they have the means and the love to do it. This is what my own parents would have done for me if they had possessed the means. I was grateful I had it to give. What I can see now, looking back at that period with the kind of clear sight that only comes after you have been hurt enough to stop making excuses for the thing that hurt you, is that this moment established the essential structure of everything that would follow. I was asked. I gave. The exchange was completed. My contribution was not mentioned again, not thanked in any sustained way, not repaid, not even acknowledged as having been a sacrifice rather than a simple transfer from surplus. The dynamic was set as clearly as a groove cut in wood. I was on one side, they were on the other, and the movement between those two sides had a single direction that everyone understood without anyone stating it. What I also did not know then, because Marcus managed information about their finances with great care, was that the surface of their marriage concealed a financial situation that was deteriorating steadily from the day after the wedding. Marcus had a particular relationship with risk. In professional settings and at dinner tables he spoke about it with the measured vocabulary of someone who took it seriously, who diversified, who thought long-term. In practice, he made a series of decisions that a person who genuinely understood risk would not have made. He had lost $40,000 in a cryptocurrency exchange in the first year of their marriage, money he had moved from their joint savings account without telling Cassandra until the loss was already complete. He had invested $28,000 in a restaurant concept in downtown Raleigh, a friend's venture that he believed in completely and that closed after 11 months without returning a cent to investors. He had put $19,000 into a private equity vehicle that a colleague had introduced him to, which was structured in a way that any qualified financial advisor would have identified immediately as having essentially no recovery mechanism for the principal. These losses, taken together, added up to $87,000 in the first 3 years of their marriage, and Marcus treated each of them the way he treated all evidence that he was fallible. He did not mention them to anyone. Cassandra knew. She told me this later, in one of the painful and honest conversations that came after everything fell apart, and the knowledge that she had known and had chosen to protect his ego rather than her own financial security is one of the things about this whole story that I find hardest to hold. She was frightened, she said. She did not know what to do. She had built her idea of their life around his confidence and his plans, and acknowledging the failures felt like pulling a thread that might unravel all of it. I understand this. I have even, at my more generous moments, forgiven it. But I cannot pretend it did not contribute to what was coming, because it did. By the time their third wedding anniversary arrived, the townhouse had not appreciated as they had hoped. Marcus had refinanced it twice to cover short-term cash gaps he described to Cassandra as temporary and to himself as timing issues. Their total unsecured debt had grown to approximately $190,000, not counting the townhouse mortgage. They were not in crisis in any dramatic sense. They were in the situation that many couples inhabit for years without ever fully naming it, financially viable on paper, fragile in practice, dependent on nothing going wrong. Nothing, in this context, included me. This is the context in which my house became interesting to them. Not because they were villains, which is too simple and also too comfortable an explanation. Marcus was a man who had convinced himself, with the flexible logic of someone who is accustomed to finding solutions, that the $780,000 house occupied by his widowed mother-in-law represented a family resource that was being underutilized. Cassandra was a woman who loved her husband and was frightened about their finances and had spent her entire adult life understanding, without ever having to state it plainly, that her mother's resources were available to her when she needed them because they always had been. Neither of these things made what they did acceptable. But they are the honest explanation of how two people who were not monsters arrived at a monstrous plan. It was a Sunday afternoon in October, 3.5 years after the wedding. Cassandra came to visit alone. Without Marcus. She arrived without calling first, which was unusual enough that I registered it before I even opened the door properly. She sat down at my kitchen table, the same table she had done homework at as a teenager, with both hands wrapped around a coffee mug and her eyes slightly unfocused, looking at the grain of the wood rather than at me. This was the posture she had taken since childhood when she needed something she was embarrassed to ask for and was working herself up to asking it. "Mom," she said. "I want to talk to you about something. And I need you to keep an open mind." I set down my own coffee. "Of course," I said. What followed, she had rehearsed. I could hear the rehearsal in it, the way certain sentences came out with too much smoothness and others stumbled slightly at the transitions. The way a speech goes when you have prepared the argument but not all the connective tissue. She began, as she always began when she wanted something, with concern for me. The Lakeview house was too large for one person to manage comfortably. 4 bedrooms, 3 full bathrooms, a finished basement, a back garden that required professional landscaping twice a month. "You're rattling around in there, Mom," she said. "It's a lot to maintain on your own." I said I managed fine. I said I liked the space. She said the neighborhood had changed. There was more traffic from the commercial development 2 blocks away. The character of the area was shifting. It wasn't as peaceful as it used to be. I noted, without saying so, that I had complained about the noise from the development once in a phone call 6 months earlier, once, casually, in passing, and she had stored it like a file she would retrieve when she needed it. And then she arrived at the actual purpose of the visit, and her voice shifted into a register I recognized from childhood, the register she used when she had decided something and was presenting it as a suggestion. She and Marcus had been thinking, she said, about my future. About what would happen as I got older. About what kind of care I might eventually need, and how important it was to think about these things proactively, before decisions had to be made under pressure. "We've been looking into some really lovely assisted living communities," she said. "Not nursing homes, Mom. I want to be clear about that. These are beautiful, vibrant places. They have fitness centers, social programming, restaurant-style dining with real chefs, medical staff available if you ever need them. You would have a real community around you. You wouldn't have to be alone in this big house." I was 68 years old. I played tennis on Tuesday and Thursday mornings with a group of women I had known for 15 years. I worked 3 days a week consulting for a local pharmacy group, doing work I found genuinely engaging and that kept my mind operating at full capacity. I drove myself everywhere, cooked my own meals from scratch, managed my own finances with the meticulous discipline I had maintained for 43 years, and had taken 3 independent trips in the previous 12 months, to see friends in Savannah, Denver, and Boston. I was not rattling around. I was living. "And we thought," Cassandra continued, her voice staying carefully in the gentle and reasonable register she had set, "that maybe if you moved somewhere like that, Marcus and I could take over the Lakeview house. We would maintain it. Keep it in the family. Keep it as yours in name. You could always come back to it whenever you wanted to visit." There it was. Fully formed and quietly stated, as if it were the most natural thought in the world. The house Gerald and I had bought for $187,000 in 1989 was currently worth, by any reasonable estimate, between $740,000 and $780,000. The home equity line I had taken out for her wedding had been paid down to approximately $52,000 still outstanding. The house was the cornerstone of my financial security. It was the largest single asset I owned. It was the place where I had lived for 30 years, where her father had lived and died, where every significant event of our family's life together had happened. And my daughter was sitting at my kitchen table with rehearsed concern in her voice and her hands folded around her coffee mug, suggesting that I move into a care facility so that she and her husband could take it. "No," I said. Cassandra blinked. She had, I think, prepared for hesitation. She had prepared for me to say I needed time to think about it, or that it was a lot to consider, or that I appreciated her concern and would sit with it. She had not prepared for the word to arrive so cleanly and so quickly, with so little negotiating room around it. "Mom, I'm not saying this has to happen right now. I'm just raising it as something to think about together. Something we can plan as a family. I appreciate that you're thinking about my future," I said. "But I am not planning to move out of my home. I would prefer not to revisit this." She left about an hour later, after we had talked about other things in the effortful way you talk about other things when a significant thing has been said and neither person knows quite where to put it. Marcus called my cell phone before she had reached the highway. He was warmer than usual, asking about my week and my tennis game and a book he remembered I had mentioned wanting to read, and then, at the end, as if it were an afterthought, he asked whether I had given any more thought to what Cassandra had brought up. I told him the same thing I had told her. He laughed in the soft and non-confrontational way he had, and said there was absolutely no rush, that they just cared about me, and that he was glad we had talked. No rush. That phrase sat with me for weeks before I understood exactly why it bothered me. It is the phrase of a man who has already established a timeline and is simply choosing not to share it with the person the timeline concerns most. What followed over the next several months was a pressure campaign conducted with patience and care. I know now that it was a campaign. At the time I experienced it as a series of individual moments I was perhaps reading too sensitively. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money, it's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow: do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases, because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. Marcus arrived at family dinners with printed materials on 2 separate occasions. Once it was a glossy brochure for a place called Meadow Glen Village, a senior living community in Durham, with photographs of women laughing in sunlit dining rooms and couples walking on paved garden paths. He set it on my kitchen counter as he came in, as if he had simply put something down, and mentioned it only once and lightly. The second time it was a printed article he had found online about the financial and practical challenges of maintaining large properties as a single older homeowner, which he placed beside my coffee as if he had brought something useful for me to read. Cassandra called me more frequently during this period, which I initially received as a warming between us. I understand now that the calls were a form of monitoring. She was checking what I was doing, how I was spending my time, who I was speaking to. She asked once, with the exact casualness of something carefully phrased to sound uncalculated, whether I had considered meeting with a financial planner to make sure my retirement funds were structured appropriately for my stage of life. She asked whether the house needed any major repairs that might become burdensome over time. She asked, on 3 separate occasions across 3 months, whether the stairs in the house were getting difficult. I was 68 years old. I walked up and down my stairs every single day without a single conscious thought about them. But here is the thing I have spent a great deal of time thinking about, because it is the most uncomfortable part of this story for me to admit. The pressure worked. Not completely, not in the way they intended, but it worked partially, in the specific way that sustained pressure from people you love always works on someone who has spent their life trying to be fair-minded about people she loved. I began, despite myself, to wonder whether their concern contained something legitimate. I began to audit my own life through their eyes, to search for the fragility they seemed to see so clearly, because surely they must be responding to something real. I caught myself at this one afternoon in February, standing at the top of my staircase looking down at the bottom of it, genuinely asking myself whether it was dangerous. Asking myself whether I was managing adequately. Asking myself whether the house was too large, whether the neighborhood really had changed, whether I was, in some way I was failing to perceive clearly, someone who needed assistance she was too proud to acknowledge needing. The stairs were fine. They had been fine for 30 years. I had walked them every day of those 30 years without incident. I went downstairs and made a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table and looked very steadily at what I had just done. I had allowed 2 people who stood to benefit significantly from my departure from my home to plant doubt about my own competence so effectively that I had been standing at the top of my own staircase evaluating it as a potential hazard. I had been absorbing their narrative so thoroughly that I had started trying to see myself through it. That was the afternoon I called Rosalind. Rosalind and I had known each other since nursing school, which put our friendship at nearly 50 years. She had been a guest at my wedding. She had driven through the night to be with me at Gerald's bedside in those final hours. She was the person I called when I needed someone who would say the thing that was true rather than the thing that was comfortable, who had never in 50 years prioritized my feelings over my well-being when the two were in conflict. She had retired to Porto, Portugal, 2 years earlier. She called me weekly and described, with increasing delight, the life she was building there. The apartment above the Douro River with windows on both sides. The neighborhood bakery where she had become a regular and where the woman at the counter now held back a specific type of custard tart for her before they sold out in the morning. The community of international friends, mostly retirees from various countries, who gathered for weekly dinners and occasional day trips into the surrounding countryside. The quality of the Portuguese public healthcare system, which she described with the specific authority of a former nurse who knew what good healthcare actually looked like. The cost of living, which made her retirement savings feel, for the first time in her life, genuinely abundant rather than perpetually at risk. You should visit, she had said, 4 or 5 times over those 2 years. Each time I had deflected. There was always something keeping me in Raleigh. I told her everything that afternoon. All of it, from the first brochure Marcus had brought to the staircase that morning. When I finished, Rosalind was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Margaret. They want your house. Not, they are going through a hard time. Not, they are genuinely worried about you." Not any of the softer framings I had been reaching for over the previous 14 months to make the situation feel manageable and to allow me to continue loving my daughter without the complication of naming what was happening. Just, they want your house. The simplicity of it was like a hand on my shoulder in a dark room. Sometimes the most generous thing another person can do for you is say the hard thing in the plainest possible way, without softening it into something you can continue to live comfortably alongside. "I know," I said. "They have always wanted your house," Rosalind said. "From the moment Marcus saw the numbers, you became their plan. Everything since then has been preparation." I sat with that for the rest of the afternoon. The conversation that ended one phase of my life and began another happened on a Thursday night in April, 4 years and 3 months after the wedding. Cassandra called at 8 in the evening. I knew Marcus was on the call too. I could hear it in the slight processing delay in her voice and in the particular quality of background silence that belongs to 2 people in the same room who are both listening. She told me she had found a wonderful place. Cedarwood Pines, a senior living community in Chapel Hill, about 25 minutes from the Lakeview house. She had toured it earlier that week. Golf course on the property. 3 separate dining venues. A full wellness center with an indoor heated pool, fitness equipment, and weekly yoga classes. She described it with the enthusiasm of someone who has been waiting to have this conversation for months and has prepared thoroughly for it. She wanted to take me to see it that weekend. I told her I did not want to see it. A pause. And then Marcus came in. His voice had the warmth he had always managed so carefully, but it had a different quality tonight, something underneath it that I recognized as finality. "Margaret," he said, "we've actually already spoken to an elder law attorney. About what the process looks like. About what our options are as family members who are concerned about your well-being and who want to make sure you're properly cared for going forward." The room contracted around me. Let me tell you what I understood in that moment, because I understood it completely and immediately, without needing to think about it. They had not consulted a lawyer because they were worried about me. They had consulted a lawyer because they were preparing to act, and they wanted to understand whether they had the legal tools to do so with or without my agreement. An elder law attorney is not a generalist. An elder law attorney specializes in precisely the legal mechanisms that become available when a family can demonstrate or argue that an aging parent lacks the capacity to manage their own affairs, guardianship proceedings, conservatorship, medical power of attorney challenges, the various instruments through which a competent adult can be reclassified, on paper and in law, as someone whose decisions require oversight. They had gone to a lawyer. They had asked, "What can we do if she says no?" "Let me be very clear with both of you," I said. My voice was steady in a way I was not entirely prepared for. I am not moving into a care facility. I am not transferring ownership of my home to anyone. And if either of you takes any legal action, of any kind, to challenge my right to manage my own life and my own property, I will retain my own attorney and I will use every resource available to me to protect myself and to document what has happened here. Do you understand me? Cassandra's voice, when it came, had lost the careful warmth. Mom, you're being paranoid. We're trying to help you. We love you. You consulted a lawyer about removing my autonomy over my own home, I said, and then you called me on a Thursday evening to present it as love. I am not being paranoid. I am paying attention. I ended the call. I sat in my living room for 4 hours that night without moving from the chair I had taken when I answered the phone. I did not turn on the television. I did not call anyone. I sat in the house that Gerald and I had bought as a young couple and filled with 30 years of a shared life, and I understood that I was at war. Not the kind of war with obvious fronts and visible combat. The quiet grinding kind, where someone slowly and patiently attempts to reclassify you from a person with rights into a problem with assets. The kind fought not with confrontation but with documents and patience and the absolute clarity that comes from finally being willing to see a situation for exactly what it is. At midnight I went to my desk and made a list. This is always what I do when the situation is serious enough to require clear thinking rather than feeling. My mother's habit. Her mother's before her. What you write down, you see. What you see, you can address. Let me tell you, precisely and without embarrassment, what I had built over 43 years of disciplined work and careful management. Because these numbers matter. They are the record of a life and the measure of what was at stake. The Lakeview house, appraised at approximately $755,000, with $52,000 remaining on the home equity line I had taken out for Cassandra's wedding. Net equity, approximately $703,000. A retirement account that I had rebuilt carefully over the 16 years since Gerald's death, making consistent contributions even through the years when Cassandra's needs had required large withdrawals, $418,000. A brokerage account I had opened 10 years earlier and contributed to steadily at $500 per month, through every market cycle, without touching it, $164,000. Savings accounts across 2 institutions, $87,000. Part-time consulting income from the pharmacy group, $38,000 per year, sufficient to cover my living expenses entirely, without touching any investment or savings account. Total net worth, by conservative estimate, $1,372,000. Against this, I had given or contributed the following to my daughter and son-in-law's life since the wedding: $197,400 for the wedding itself, $18,000 furnishing their townhouse, $7,500 toward a car down payment when Cassandra's vehicle failed inspection and they said they could not cover the deposit that month, $4,200 toward a vacation to Costa Rica that Marcus had described as a trip they really needed, emotionally, and that they could not quite manage without a little help. $11,000 toward a bathroom renovation in the townhouse, contributed when Marcus said the contractor needed a deposit before they had saved enough and that the timeline would be lost if they waited. $6,400 toward what Marcus described as a short-term business need he would repay me within 60 days. He did not repay it. And a collection of smaller amounts, some of which I could reconstruct from my ledger and some of which had not been recorded as carefully as the larger ones, but which I estimated at a further $8,000 in aggregate. Total given since the wedding, $252,500. I wrote that number on a piece of paper and I sat with it for a long time. $250,000, given in love and given freely and given without any of it ever once being acknowledged as a sacrifice, never mind repaid. Then I picked up the telephone and called Patricia Okafor. Patricia had been my family's attorney since Gerald was alive and had handled everything from our wills to the estate administration after his death. She was 63 years old, precise and organized and completely unmoved by the social pressures that cause some people to soften difficult truths. She practiced law the way I practiced pharmacy, with full attention to what the situation actually was rather than what it would be more comfortable for it to be. She listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, she asked me a series of questions that told me immediately she was already building a picture. When had I first noticed the pressure about the house? About 14 months ago. How many separate occasions, between then and Thursday night, had involved some form of pressure about the house or my capacity to manage my own life? I counted: the brochures, the printed article, the phone calls about my health, the questions about the stairs, the Thanksgiving comment from Marcus about the difficulty of maintaining large properties on a single person's fixed income, the birthday visit where Cassandra had mentioned that a colleague's mother was so much happier since moving into a senior community. At least 9 or 10 distinct moments. Patricia wrote this down. "That is not spontaneous concern," she said. "That is a systematic and sustained preparation. They have been building toward that phone call for at minimum a year. The attorney consultation was almost certainly not an impulsive decision made in the last few weeks. It is more likely the culmination of a plan that was already well advanced." She set her pen down and looked at me directly. "Everything they have done so far is legal. Consulting an attorney is legal. Applying informal pressure is unpleasant and in my view morally indefensible, but it is not legally actionable. What matters now is that we move before they do. We close every door they might try to open. No joint accounts, no outdated estate documents, no ambiguities in your legal arrangements that could be exploited. And we establish, in writing and on the record, that you are in full possession of your faculties and are making your decisions with complete awareness and competence." She paused. "And then you tell me what you want to do with your home. Not what might preserve the relationship. Not what they want. What you want." I had not been asked that question, about my own desires independent of anyone else's claims on them, in more years than I could precisely count. The following Thursday I had a comprehensive medical evaluation with Dr. Annette Walsh, who had been my physician for 14 years. Blood work, a full cognitive assessment administered by a neurologist Patricia recommended, blood pressure and cardiovascular evaluation, a complete review of all medications and their management. The results came back within a week. I was in excellent health for my age, with no cognitive concerns of any kind, no physical limitations affecting my daily function, and every marker of someone managing her own life with full competence and capacity. Patricia had these results documented in a formal letter, co-signed by both Dr. Walsh and the neurologist, on both physicians' letterhead. She filed them in my legal records and kept a certified copy in her own office files. The estate documents were revised in their entirety. The old will, which I had written 15 years earlier in the first raw year after Gerald's death and which reflected what I had felt then, that Cassandra should inherit everything, was revoked and replaced. In the new will, the Lakeview house would pass to a charitable remainder trust established at my death, managed by a board of trustees that included Patricia and 2 other individuals with no connection to Cassandra or Marcus. Cassandra would receive a cash distribution representing 10% of the house's appraised value at the time of my death. Nothing more. The remainder of my estate was restructured along similar principles, charitable organizations I had cared about for years, with modest specific bequests to Rosalind and 2 other friends who had been genuine and present in my life. I went to my bank and closed the joint savings account that I had added Cassandra to several years earlier in a gesture of generosity I had never mentioned to her and she had never thanked me for. The account held $43,000. I transferred the full balance to a new personal account in my name alone. The branch manager, who had known me for years, asked whether I was certain. I told her I was completely certain. I felt, in the days after these actions were taken, the particular quality of relief that comes from having done the things you should have done long before. Not triumph. Not anger. A kind of solidity, the feeling of standing on ground that is actually beneath your feet rather than ground you are still hoping will hold. 3 weeks after the Thursday night phone call, Cassandra arrived at my front door on a Saturday morning without calling ahead. She was alone. Her makeup had been recently and imperfectly repaired. She had the posture she had taken since girlhood when approaching a conversation she had been putting off and had finally decided she could not postpone any longer. I let her in because she was my daughter and I loved her with the complete and structural love that a mother has for a child she carried and raised, the kind that does not diminish when the person has hurt you badly and does not simplify no matter how much you might occasionally wish it would. She sat on the living room couch, where she had sat as a small girl watching Saturday morning cartoons, and she cried with the genuine and ungoverned quality of someone who is no longer managing a situation but simply feeling it. She said that Marcus had been the architect of the attorney conversation, that the financial pressure of the previous 2 years had been building in ways she had not known how to handle, and that she had gone along with his plan because she was frightened and because she had, in her fear, made the catastrophic error of allowing his solutions to become hers. I listened to all of it. I handed her tissues when she needed them. I did not reach over to hold her hand in the automatic maternal way I would have, once, before I understood what that automatic giving had made possible. When she had finished, I said what I needed to say. What you and Marcus were planning to do was not a conversation about my well-being. It was a plan to take my home. The home your father and I spent 30 years building our life in. The asset that constitutes the foundation of my financial security for whatever years remain to me. You consulted lawyers about mechanisms to remove my right to decide what happens to that home. That is what happened, and I need you to hear me say it clearly rather than in the softened version. She said nothing. And this comes after years during which you accepted financial support from me, substantial support, without ever once asking whether it was a strain, whether any of it was costing me something I could not easily replace, whether I was all right. I paid for your education. I paid for your wedding. I furnished your home. I contributed to your car, your vacations, your renovations. At no point in any of those years did you look at me and ask, "Mom, are you okay? Is any of this hard for you?" Cassandra was crying differently now, not the managed tears of someone navigating a difficult conversation but the real kind that come from somewhere below strategy. "I didn't think about it that way," she said. "I just always knew you were there. I took that for granted." "I'm sorry." "I know you are," I said. "And I believe the apology is genuine. But genuine apologies cannot undo what has been understood. What happened showed me something about how I am seen by you, and about a pattern between us that has been operating for a long time, and that I should have named and changed years ago. I did not name it. That is partly my responsibility. But the responsibility for where it led is not mine alone." She looked at me for a long moment. "Can we start over?" "I'm not able to have that conversation today," I said. "But I am not closing the door on it." She left. I watched her car from the window and felt the ache that has no adequate name, the specific pain of a relationship with someone you love that has been altered past the possibility of returning to what it was. Then I went to my desk and I continued planning. 2 weeks after that Saturday visit, I booked a flight to Porto. I told no one except Patricia. I packed for 2 weeks, locked up the house, and flew on a Tuesday morning with a window seat and a novel I had been meaning to read for a year. I did not call Cassandra. I did not call Marcus. Rosalind was waiting at the arrivals barrier holding a hand-lettered cardboard sign that read Margaret, New Life in large careful letters. I laughed out loud in the arrivals hall of a Portuguese airport in a way I had not laughed in longer than I could precisely date. She drove me through the city in the late afternoon, and I pressed my face toward the car window like a child because the light was doing something I had not been prepared for. The late afternoon light in Porto arrives at an angle that seems deliberately generous, as if it has come all that way specifically to illuminate these particular streets, and it finds the terracotta roof tiles and the pale stone facades and the painted azulejo tiles and makes everything glow with a warmth that you can feel through the car window. I did not speak for the first 10 minutes. Rosalind, who has known me for 50 years, understood that silence perfectly and did not fill it. We spent 2 weeks together. We walked through the Ribera district along the waterfront every evening. We sat in small cafes and stayed for hours without anyone expecting us to leave. We took a boat up the Douro River one afternoon and drank wine from the valley while the terraced vineyards rose on both sides above the water. I ate things I had not known existed before that trip: salt cod prepared 12 different ways, a soup made with bread and garlic and cilantro that seemed impossibly simple and was impossibly good, pastillas de nata from the bakery near Rosalind's apartment that were warm from the oven each morning and that no description does adequate justice to. I met Rosalind's circle of friends. International retirees and expats who had all arrived in Porto from some version of the same recognition that their lives were happening in the present tense and they had been waiting for circumstances to change before they allowed themselves to fully participate. They were curious, present, engaged people who had given themselves permission to be fully alive, and the permission had suited them. One of them was Hilda. 72 years old, a former architect from Copenhagen, who had come to Porto 3 years earlier after her adult children arranged the sale of the family home while she was traveling in Japan for a month. She came home to an empty house and a bank transfer representing what they had calculated as her share after expenses. They had authorized the sale using a medical power of attorney she had signed before a minor surgical procedure 2 years earlier, which she had not imagined, at the time of signing, would be used for anything except what it had been presented as, authorization for medical decisions in the event she could not make them herself. I thought of the elder law attorney. I thought of the phrase, "What our options are as family members concerned about your well-being." "What did you do?" I asked. "I hired a lawyer and fought it," she said, with the equanimity of someone who has arrived somewhere past the anger. "I lost. The sale was legal, just barely, under the specific terms of that document. But the money they sent was enough to come here. And here I am." She looked around the table at the people and the food and the wine and the warm evening. "They did me an accidental favor, in the end. I would not have had the courage to come on my own." On the plane home, I wrote 14 pages in my journal. By the time the wheels touched the tarmac in Charlotte, I had made 2 decisions that felt as settled and solid as anything I had ever decided. I was going to sell the Lakeview house. On my terms, at full market value, for my own benefit and my own future, not given or transferred or signed over to anyone. And when the sale closed, I was moving to Porto. I returned from Portugal on a Sunday evening. On Monday morning I called Patricia and told her. She was not surprised. She said good and asked what timeline I was working toward. On Tuesday I called my financial advisor, James Whitfield, and told him I needed to restructure my entire financial situation around a permanent international relocation, including understanding the Portuguese tax arrangements for foreign retirees and establishing appropriate investment structures for the proceeds of the house sale. He said he would have a comprehensive plan ready within 10 days. On Wednesday I called Shirley Bounds. Patricia had recommended her as the best residential realtor in the Lakeview market, a woman who had been selling homes in that neighborhood for over 20 years and who knew its pricing dynamics as well as anyone in the city. Shirley walked through the house on Thursday afternoon and gave me her honest assessment. With some targeted updates, she believed the house would list strongly at $789,000 and would almost certainly sell within 60 days. I authorized her to proceed. I did not call Cassandra. I did not call Marcus. I called Rosalind, who responded with a sound I will not attempt to reproduce in writing but which communicated pure and unqualified delight. I told Patricia, who said she was glad. That was the complete list of people I informed. The following Monday, a crew of workers arrived. New hardware on every cabinet in the kitchen, the small change that makes an entire room read as refreshed. Fresh paint throughout the entry hall and main living areas in the warm white that Shirley said photographed best and made rooms feel both larger and more welcoming. The hardwood floors, which had gone dull over the years in the way that hardwood floors do when life is being lived on them, were refinished to their original depth and warmth by a team who spent 4 days on the work and did it with the care of craftsmen who take their craft seriously. When they finished, the house looked the way it had looked in the years when Gerald and I were in our early 50s, when we still had the energy and attention for its maintenance, cared for and warm and unmistakably a home that someone had loved. Shirley listed it on a Thursday. By the following Tuesday we had 4 offers in hand. The highest offer came from a couple in their mid-30s who had walked through the house twice and who had, according to Shirley, stood in the back garden on their second visit and simply looked at it in silence for several minutes. They offered $797,500, $8,500 above the asking price, with a 45-day close and no contingencies beyond the standard inspection. I accepted without countering. There was nothing to counter. The closing took place on a Tuesday morning in July, at a conference table with the buyers and their agent and the title company representative. Shirley had arranged for me to do a final walkthrough of the house the afternoon before, alone, and I took my time with it. The furniture and all of my belongings had been moved to storage the week before. The house was empty in the specific way of a place that has held a great deal and is now between one chapter and another. The floors were clean. The walls were bright with the new paint. The afternoon light came through the windows in the kitchen the way it always had, in a long slant across the floor tiles that I had loved for 30 years without ever thinking consciously about loving it. I stood in the doorway of Cassandra's childhood bedroom for a long time. The room where I had read to her every night until she was old enough to tell me she was too old for that, and then for a few more years after that anyway. The room where she had done her homework and kept her diary and pinned her photograph of Belmere Estate to the wall and dreamed the dreams that I had spent so much of my life trying to make real for her. I stood in the master bedroom where Gerald had died, in the room that had been ours for 30 years, surrounded by the particular quality of a shared life that does not survive the removal of the furniture and the objects but that I could feel in the proportions of the space and in the quality of the light and in the simple fact of having stood in that room 10,000 times before this final one. I stood in the kitchen where I had cooked several thousand meals and drunk several thousand cups of coffee and done the ordinary unrecorded work of a life, the work that makes no narrative but constitutes everything. I said goodbye to each room quietly and without performing equanimity I did not entirely feel. Some things deserve to be mourned honestly. Grief that is rushed through or dressed up as something more comfortable is grief that will arrive again later with less warning. Then I walked through the front door, pulled it closed behind me for the last time, handed the keys to Shirley, got in my car, and drove away. I did not look back at the house from the street. Some departures are better made clean. The proceeds from the sale, after retiring the remaining balance on the home equity line and paying all closing costs and commissions, came to $728,300. James Whitfield and I had prepared the structure in advance. A significant portion went into a conservatively managed investment portfolio structured around the Portuguese non-habitual resident tax regime, which provided substantial tax advantages for foreign retirees in the first 10 years of residence. A portion went into an annuity that would generate predictable monthly income independent of market conditions. A third portion was held in liquid savings across two institutions, accessible without penalty for any purpose. When the distribution was complete and the accounts settled, my total net worth stood at approximately $1,530,000. The highest it had ever been at any point in my working life. Higher than it had been on the day of Gerald's death, despite everything I had given away in the years between. Higher than it had been on the day of Cassandra's wedding, despite the $197,400 I had spent that week alone. 43 years of disciplined work had made me genuinely, solidly, quietly wealthy in ways that had been partially obscured by 2 decades of giving without limit. And I had come within one Thursday night phone call of allowing someone else to determine what happened to that wealth. The weeks between the house closing and my departure for Porto had a quality I find difficult to describe accurately, because they were not one thing. They were grief and relief and practicality and a kind of readiness that had no precedent in my previous experience of myself. I gave things away with efficiency and without excessive sentimentality. Furniture to people who needed it, books to the public library, kitchenware and linens to a resale charity. Some things went to Cassandra, delivered by a hired van, with a handwritten note tucked inside each piece acknowledging its history and its origin. She called me after the van came. She cried. I listened, and I did not soften what was happening by pretending it was anything other than what it was. I kept very little. 2 suitcases and a carry-on. Gerald's watch, which I do not wear on my wrist but which I carry in my bag every single day. A framed photograph of the two of us on our 20th anniversary, taken at the waterfront in Beaufort with the boats behind us and both of us squinting a little into the sun. My mother's recipe box, which is held together with a rubber band and which I would not leave behind for any amount of money. My jewelry. My documents. My journal. Everything else I released. There is a lightness to traveling with very little that I had forgotten in 30 years of accumulated life in one place. When I stood in the arrivals hall in Porto and heard Rosalind laugh at her own sign, I felt that lightness as something close to physical, a buoyancy, a freedom of movement I had not felt in longer than I could accurately say. Marcus called me before I left. He was not warm. The warmth he had maintained so carefully for years had been set aside, and in its place was something more direct, which I appreciated even as I disagreed with everything he said. He told me I was being vindictive. That I was punishing Cassandra for one conversation that had been badly handled. That I was destroying the family's financial stability out of spite. He said I would be lonely in Portugal. He said I was too old to start over in a foreign country. He said I would regret it. I listened to everything. Then I said, Marcus, you consulted a lawyer about the legal mechanisms available for taking my home. You spent more than a year conducting a careful and sustained pressure campaign designed to convince me I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs, so that I would be more receptive to moving into a care facility and transferring my house to you. I have comprehensive medical documentation establishing that I am in full possession of my faculties. I chose to sell. I chose Portugal. I made these choices with complete awareness of what I was doing and why. I am not being vindictive. I am managing my own life, which I am entitled to do. He said, you'll be back within 6 months. I thanked him for the call and hung up. I am writing this 2 years later from the terrace of my apartment in Porto. I have not been back. I called Cassandra the evening before my flight. I told her the house had closed and that I was leaving in the morning. The silence after I said this had a particular quality, the silence of someone absorbing something they had perhaps known was coming but had not fully prepared for. When are you coming back? She asked. I don't know, I said. I'm not planning to. I'll visit when I can, and I hope you'll come to Porto. Mom. Her voice broke. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for all of it. I know, I said. I believe you. We talked for 30 minutes. Not a resolution, because resolutions are rarely the thing that happen in real conversations between people who have hurt each other. More like the beginning of the longer and harder conversation that would take years to fully have. She did not ask for money. I did not offer any. For the first time in our adult relationship, that particular current between us was still. I landed in Porto on a Tuesday afternoon. Rosalind was at the airport with her sign. The apartment she had found for me was in the Bonfim neighborhood, 4th floor of a restored building, small terrace with a view of rooftops and a slice of the Douro in the distance. Not large. Not what I had left. Perfect. I slept 10 hours a night for the first 2 weeks and woke each morning briefly uncertain of where I was, and then I remembered, and the remembering felt like relief settling through me the way warmth does when you come in from cold. I enrolled in Portuguese language classes 3 mornings a week with a teacher named Sophia who had the genuine teaching gift, the capacity to make you feel capable even when you are wrong, to communicate that the mistakes are simply the mechanism of learning rather than evidence of inadequacy. She told me once that the best language learners are people comfortable with being temporarily wrong in front of others. I told her I had spent the previous year defending my mental competence against an elder law attorney consultation, and that I had developed a considerable comfort with discomfort. She laughed and said that explained why I was progressing faster than most of her students her age. By 6 months I could manage every practical situation in Portuguese, the market, the pharmacy, the bank, the community center, the municipal office, all of it. By 12 months I could have a genuine conversation. By now, 2 full years in, I occasionally dream in Portuguese, which Rosalind tells me is the true marker of having actually arrived. I volunteer 2 mornings a week at a community center in Bonfim, helping with a financial literacy program for older residents run by a retired banker named Antonio, who has 30 years of experience and an absolute and clear-eyed understanding of the ways financial systems can be used to harm people who do not understand them. We teach older adults, many on modest fixed incomes and living alone, how to read documents before they sign them. How to recognize when a family member is seeking financial access and dressing it in the language of concern. How to find legal help when they need it. How to say no to pressure that is presented as love. Every session there are women in the room who have lived some version of what I lived. I tell them what I know. I tell them that love and financial exploitation can exist in the same relationship, delivered by the same person, and that recognizing the exploitation does not require you to stop loving. I tell them that protecting yourself is not the opposite of being a good mother. It is a condition of being one. Hilda comes to the sessions occasionally as a guest speaker. She tells her story without softening any of it and watches the recognition move through the room like a current. She has started a small architecture restoration practice here in Porto, doing the work she has loved her entire career on buildings that have needed it for 100 years, and she is more herself than I have ever known her, which is a thing I find genuinely moving every time I think about it. Rosalind has a companion now, a Belgian retired diplomat named Edouard who speaks 4 languages and cooks elaborate Sunday dinners for whoever wants to come, which is usually 8 or 10 people crowded joyfully around a table designed for 6. These are my Sundays. This is what a Sunday feels like when every part of it is chosen rather than assigned. Cassandra came to Porto in November, 8 days. I showed her the city and the river and introduced her to Rosalind and Hilda and the people who have become my community here. She walked beside me in the Ribeira on the second evening as the sun was going down over the water, and she went quiet in the way that people go quiet when a place surprises them past their expectations of it. On her last evening we sat on my terrace with wine and she said, "Mom, you seem more like yourself than you have in years." I thought about what that meant. The self she was describing was a version of me she had known before the decades of self-erasure had gradually replaced the person I was with the person I was in relation to her needs. "I think that's the most accurate thing you've said to me in years," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry we almost took this from you," she said. I looked at my daughter's face in the Porto evening light. 42 years old, sitting on my terrace in a country she would not have thought to visit on her own, looking at a life I had built after everything she and her husband had tried to do to prevent me from building it. I loved her with the complete and aching love of 30 years of motherhood, and I held in the same moment the full knowledge of what she had done, and I did not try to resolve those two things into something simpler than they were. "I'm glad you didn't," I said. "We are not fully healed. I would be dishonest to tell you we are. There are things that were said and done and planned that altered the landscape between us in ways that are not reversible, and we both know it, and we navigate that changed landscape with a caution we did not previously need and that we are both still learning the shape of. But she comes to Porto twice a year. She calls every week. She asks how I am and she waits for the actual answer. She has stopped treating my life as a resource available to her and started treating it as something that belongs to me. There is a word in Portuguese that I have been thinking about since I arrived here, saudade. It resists exact translation, which is part of why the Portuguese are proud of it. The closest English gets is a bittersweet longing for something you have loved and lost, or for something you never quite had, or for the distance between what was and what might have been. I feel it sometimes when I think about the Lakeview house. About Gerald and his reading chair. About the daughter I raised and the version of her I still, beneath everything, believe she is capable of becoming. About all the years I spent giving without asking myself what I wanted, and how different things might have looked if I had started asking sooner. Saudade for those things is honest, and I do not try to argue myself out of it. It lives alongside the joy, which is also real. It lives alongside the freedom, which is the most real thing I have felt in 30 years. It is part of what it means to have had a full life and to have arrived somewhere that is genuinely new. I am 71 years old. My net worth stands at approximately $1,480,000, after the purchase of my Porto apartment, the investment restructuring, and 2 full years of living expenses in a city that is beautiful and, by the standards of any place I have previously lived, remarkably affordable. I exercise regularly. I eat well. I see my doctor every 6 months and leave the appointment having been told what I already know, that I am in good health and doing the right things. I sleep deeply and without the low-grade anxiety of someone whose financial future is contingent on circumstances she cannot control. I am genuinely, measurably, verifiably healthier at 71 than I was at 65. This is what I gave myself by not giving the house away. I want to say one thing directly to anyone watching this who recognizes something in what I have described. Not as instruction. Not as a prescription for what you should do. But because I wish someone had said it to me plainly, years before I needed it most. Your assets are yours. Your home is yours. Your future is yours. The love you feel for your children is real and it does not require you to fund their lives indefinitely or to make yourself financially vulnerable in service of their comfort. Generosity is a gift. The moment someone treats your generosity as an obligation, as something they are owed, as a resource to be managed, the nature of what is being exchanged has already changed, and pretending otherwise is not kindness. It is something closer to a slow harm. The woman who stood at the top of her own staircase wondering whether it was dangerous. The woman who kept quiet about the home equity line and the retirement penalty because she did not want to complicate her daughter's joy. The woman who absorbed 14 months of carefully crafted pressure because she was trying to be fair-minded about the motivations of people she loved. That was me. I am not ashamed of her. But I wish she had named what was happening 12 months earlier than she did. And I wish she had made the call to Patricia on the day of the first brochure rather than on the night of the phone call. You do not have to wait as long as I did. You are allowed to be competent. You are allowed to have a future. You are allowed to sell the house and change the will and book the flight. You are allowed to love your children and to refuse to be consumed by them. These two things are not in conflict. They never were. You are allowed to move to Portugal at 68 and learn the name of the woman at the bakery who holds back the best custard tarts for you each morning, and to walk to that bakery every day in the particular golden light of a city that took you in without asking anything of you in return, and to become, through effort and intention and the hard-won clarity of someone who finally stopped waiting for permission, the most alive version of yourself that remains possible. Gerald would have approved. I know this the way I know very few things, with the deep settled certainty that belongs to 30 years of knowing a person. He would have sat on this terrace and watched the river catch the light and he would have said, in the direct and uncomplicated way that was the best thing about him, that I had done right by myself, and that it was about time. I raise my glass to that. To the house I loved and left. To the daughter I love and am still learning how to love at a distance that is finally honest. To the 43 years of work that made this freedom possible. And to every woman watching this who is standing at the top of her own staircase, wondering whether it is safe, who has been absorbing the pressure for longer than it deserved, who has not yet made the call but who is, perhaps, a little closer to it than she was before today. You do not need to wait as long as I did. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours, and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.